Welcome, everyone. I'm Patricia Munro, part of the network leadership team. I am delighted to welcome you to this executive briefing on Network Innovation Labs. In the next 30 minutes, we'll look at innovation from a very different lens, not as a department or process, but something far more dynamic, a network phenomenon. We'll explore how innovation emerges when the right connections are made and how each phase of innovation requires a different kind of network to succeed. More importantly, we'll show how you can begin shaping these networks in your own organization to unlock innovation at scale. I'm joined by Jeffrey Beeson, a true pioneer in this space. Jeffrey is the author of Network Leadership, published by Cambridge University Press. He combines the strategic sharpness of his McKinsey and Bain days with a deep systems understanding of how people, organizations, and ideas connect. He's helped global firms move from complexity to clarity, not by simplifying reality, but by learning how to navigate it through networks. So, to kick us off, Jeffrey will reframe how we think about innovation itself. Jeffrey?
Thank you, Patricia. I'm going to start with the basics here because I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm going to begin with the question, what is a network? And actually, a network is amazingly simple. It has only three elements. It has nodes. Those are the active agents in a network that are doing work, interacting with each other. In a human network, that's usually people. And then the nodes are connected in one way or another. And then finally, the third element is the information, the data, or whatever else is flowing through those connections. So let's take, for example, a postal system. The nodes are the people who are writing and receiving the letters. And they're connected in various ways. They're connected through planes or trains or maybe even bicycles. And then finally, the information is the message in the letters. That's what's traveling through the postal system. So that's a very simple system of network. And that's the way all networks are. They're really those are the only elements in a network. And it repeats itself everywhere. You see this kind of structure in nature, the internet, or even your organization. So now let's go one step further. What happens when a network is disrupted? Now let's take that postal system, postal network as an example. Back in the 19th century, the telegraph was introduced. It didn't change the nodes, the people writing the messages and receiving them, but it did radically reconfigure the connections and how information flowed through the network. Suddenly, with the telegraph, a message that took days by horse or rail could be transmitted in seconds. And that is the essence of innovation. It's not always creating something entirely new, but most of the time, it's about reconfiguring the connections that allow value to move through the network. And by the way, this is not the exception. It's the rule. Over 90% of innovation happens this way. It's not about a lone genius inventing something from scratch. It's about connecting what already exists in new and useful ways across silos, sectors, disciplines, and perspectives. Let me give you three further examples just to really establish this pattern. The first example I'm going to take a look at is FlixBus. FlixBus is a platform for intercity bus travel. And what FlixBus did is it didn't buy any buses. What it did, it built a platform that connected independent bus operators with passengers. No buses, no depots, just a smart coordination layer that leveraged underutilized capacity. The network insight from this example is that FlixBus basically rewired the connections between supply and demand, similar to what we saw in the example of the postal system. So let me give you a second example, a very different example of how connections shift and help innovate. The well-known furniture retailer IKEA is well known for its flat pack furniture. However, IKEA didn't invent flat pack furniture or the self-service warehouses where customers pick up and take their furniture home. But it brought these two concepts, these two ideas together into a single coherent system and wrapped that into a distinct brand experience. The network insight from this is very interesting. It's the connection and connecting existing ideas, existing processes in a novel way that leads to an innovative new offering, which is what IKEA was able to bring to the network and to the marketplace. Let me give you a third example of how changing connections leads to innovation. And that is the Zalando Circle by Zalando. And Zalando is a platform or a portal for clothes, and it prides itself in having a very direct connection to its customers. And when it heard that all of a sudden there was a need or a growing concern about fashion and ecological sustainability, Zalando didn't wait. It heard what their customers were saying, and it launched Circle, a pre-owned fashion platform inside of its main app. And they were able to do that very quickly to satisfy customer needs. The network insight here is that the connections and close connections to your customer, as well as connections back to your operations, can lead to very quick innovation as the market shifts and moves. So having the right connections and the agile connections is also a source of innovation. So you may be asking, okay, fine, but what about the other 10% of innovation? Yeah, there are some breakthrough technologies that come from, well, they feel like they're coming from nowhere. Things like CRISPR that are doing gene splicing or quantum computing are novelties that are changing and bringing innovation in a very different way. But I'd like to point out that even these innovations are about connecting ideas in new ways. So in the case of CRISPR, it was about understanding how bacterial immune systems respond to viruses and copying that capability to be able to splice genes. So making a connection with how nature works was what led to that breakthrough. So here's what I'd like to leave you with in terms of innovation. Innovation doesn't come from isolated brilliance. It comes from connected intelligence. The more intelligently and creatively we build those connections between people, ideas, technologies, and needs, the more innovative we become. So why is this network view of innovation so important? Because networks aren't just a metaphor. They're how the world actually works. Every complex system, from ecosystems to economies to organizations, is structured as a network. And in the last 2 decades, network science has emerged as a powerful way to understand how these systems function, adapt, and evolve. Network science helps us explain the patterns beneath the surface, not just what is happening, but why it is happening. So this is the reason, for instance, that a new restaurant becomes fully booked. Not only because of the great food, but because word of mouth travels through trusted local connectors. Or why certain employees become informal hubs of innovation or problem solving, even if they're not high in the hierarchy of an org chart. Or why grassroots movements spread with amazing and surprising speed when key individuals activate and amplify others. Also tells us why health behaviors, both good and bad, can ripple through society. And finally, yes, why platforms like Airbnb can scale so explosively by connecting unused capacity with unmet demand. These patterns aren't accidents. They're the product of how nodes, connections, and information interact in real-world systems. So when we say innovation is a network issue, we mean it literally. If you want to foster more innovation, you have to intentionally shape the networks that make it possible. And that brings us to the next part of our journey, understanding the phases of innovation. This is important because each phase requires a different network structure. And to explore that, I'm going to hand it back to Patricia, who will walk us through the 4 phases of innovation and the network dynamics that make each one succeed or stall. Patricia.
Thanks, Jeff. Now we've seen how innovation is driven by networks. So here's the next key idea. Innovation doesn't happen all at once. It moves through 4 distinctive phases, each with its own rhythm, risks, and relationship needs. So let's just quickly go through that, and Jeff will do a deep dive after I've given you the overview. Discovery is where ideas spark through fresh perspectives and unlikely connections. Development is where promising ideas are tested, shaped, and refined. Dissemination are where insights are scaled and shared across the organization. And delivery is where ideas become reality. They're launched, implemented, and documented. But here's the catch. Each of these phases requires a different kind of network. And that's where things often break down. And you don't use the same muscles or the same connections to discover an idea as you do to deliver it at scale. So Jeffrey, in the next session, will show you how to configure your networks for each phase and how the right tools make those networks visible, intentional, and powerful. Jeffrey?
Let's now turn to what this means in practice. What I'm going to do is show you some diagrams of networks for each of these phases, and you'll see that each of these networks is different. Now, these are not abstract diagrams. They reflect real patterns that we observe in high-performing organizations. Let me begin with discovery. And in discovery, you'll see a diagram which has a loose network and many what we'll call weak ties. In other words, people that are not really attached to the network. This is important because in the discovery stage, what you're trying to do is generate new ideas and new connections. And the innovation in this case usually begins at the edge of a network. This is where people who are not so well connected to the rest of the network can come into collision and bring in new perspectives, new ideas, unexpected viewpoints. And by having those loose connections brought into the network, serendipity can happen, new ideas can be sparked. And so this is the kind of network activity you want to see. Discovery thrives on these loose, diverse networks, full of weak ties that expose the system to novelty. Now, companies intrinsically have understood this, and they've taken many steps to actually foster serendipity. They, for instance, have created academic partnerships to go outside of their organization. They have supported startups through incubators. They've created alliances across industries or created platforms inside their organizations to gather ideas. And also hosted or attended innovation conferences. These are all smart moves, by the way. But here's the question that I have. Are these companies using their networks optimally? Too often, what I see is that companies pursue what I will call a push strategy. That's when companies set an agenda, they're looking for X, and then go looking for that specific answer to a specific question. It's like walking through a forest. If you're only looking for mushrooms, you may miss the squirrel running up the tree or the birds singing in the background. The unexpected. What is far more powerful is what I'm going to call a pull strategy. And that is cultivating networks that naturally attract new ideas and allow insights to emerge from the edges. Discovery actually requires a different kind of attention than we're typically used to. It requires listening without an agenda, asking questions where we don't necessarily know the answer, and allowing the network to surprise us. Okay, let me move on to development. Now, development is where ideas are moved in and become reality. And what you'll see here is a network that's fairly what I will call dense. And it's fairly, people are well connected to each other for the most part, at least in the center. And the reason for that is that there's a real need for quick and trust-based communication. Discovery may spark the idea, but that idea is fragile. And it's in development where the real work to make it functional product or service really begins. It's where the testing, the shaping, the refining takes place. This phase depends on tight-knit, trust-rich networks. Not just anyone in the room, really those people who are willing to challenge, co-create, and commit. This is what I call sort of the campfire moment, because you need people who are able and willing to say, this won't work, but here's how I think it might work. In other words, constantly thinking about how to make it work and being allowed to express that opinion. What drives progress here isn't consensus, but it's what I call constructive friction in a psychologically safe environment. And while discovery thrives on novelty, development thrives on trust, the kind that allows people to experiment, fail fast, and try again. But here's something many teams overlook. Even the most capable internal teams often don't have all the expertise they need. That's why high-performing development teams share another key trait. They know how to reach out. They actively tap into external networks, partners, specialists, universities, even competitors, drawing in knowledge that accelerates progress. And that's why you see in this diagram a bunch of circles, a bunch of nodes on the periphery, on the outside. And those represents the resources that this team needs to bring in to make the development happen. This requires a specific skill, which I call network navigation. That is the ability to find, connect with, and bring the right people in at the right time. It's not about knowing everything, but it is about knowing someone who does know someone who might know something. And that's the power of the 6 degrees of separation. Great development teams aren't closed circles. They're what I will call porous clusters, grounded in trust, but fluent in connection. They know how to hold the center and reach the edge. Let me move on to dissemination. So the idea has been generated, it's been worked on, but now people need to know about it. that idea needs to travel. Other people need to find out about it. And dissemination isn't about necessarily broadcasting from the top of the organization. It's about activating the right messengers. And so what you see here is a diagram of a messenger, which I will call a well-connected hub in a network, has many connections potentially across functions. That's what you see in this diagram. And what you want to do is find those people, find those messengers. And these people are not necessarily the most seniors, but they really tend to be the most trusted. We talk about networks of influence. What that means is that there are informal hubs inside of a network, people who bridge across boundaries. These are your translators, your interpreters, your multipliers. Network science has shown that ideas spread farther and faster when passed through these relational bridges, not formal reporting lines. So if you want to scale adoption, you have to map the trust in the network, not the org chart. So let me finally move to delivery. And delivery is about making it real, bringing it into the marketplace, and making it a successful service or product. So now what we see here is that delivery requires execution. It requires also adaptability for unforeseen circumstances as the test the market and understand how the market works. And so here again, a responsive execution network is required that's well connected, but it's all about coordination. Think of this kind of network as a living mesh. Cross-functional teams, rapid feedback loops, fluid handoffs, real-time adaptation. This isn't about rigid plans. This is about dynamic connection. You need networks that are strong enough to hold the effort together and flexible enough to adjust when things inevitably change. If innovation is fire, delivery is the hearth, solid enough to contain the fire, but open enough to keep it burning clean. So what happens when a company truly rewires its innovation networks? Let's take a look at what this can mean. The example I'm going to look at is GE Appliances, which is a part of the Haier group. They, interestingly enough, didn't create a single innovation team. What they did is they decentralized innovation capacity and embedded it across the business through adaptive networks. And by doing so, they had amazing results. In just 5 years, they had over 2,500 innovations. 1/3 of these innovations in new product areas. They had double-digit growth as a result of this innovation drive in a marketplace in an industry that was growing at around 2% per year. And this extreme, amazing growth allowed them to move from number 5 in the marketplace to number 1 in the US appliance market. So they did this not by managing innovation as a process, but by unleashing it as a network phenomenon. The takeaway, innovation is a network journey, and each phase requires a network designed for that phase. And discovery, it needs to be diverse, exploratory, pull-based. For development, it needs to be tight, trust-based, and yet able to reach out. For dissemination, influence-based, finding those people that are well-connected and can bridge boundaries in an organization. And finally, delivery, operational, fast, and responsive. Treating these phases as the same, well, that's like planting, watering, harvesting, and cooking. with one utensil. When you shape your networks with intention, you don't just generate innovation, you make it move and stick. Patricia?
Thanks, Jeff. So, how do you actually do this in an organization? How do you shape the right networks at the right time and build the capacities to cultivate and advance innovation, not just spark it? That's where network innovation labs come in. Think of it as a greenhouse where fragile new ideas can grow in protected yet generative environments, or a radar system which scans the edges for weak signals, emerging patterns, and inference points, or a training ground where teams learn to work in new ways, building the habits of a network collaboration, sensing, and influence. But here's what makes them different. They're embedded, not isolated. So network labs work within real business contexts, not off to the side. They focus on connections, not just content. It's not just what's the idea, but who needs to be connected for this to succeed. They're intentionally limited in scale. That's not a weakness, it's a strength. Because by design, network innovation labs start small to minimize risk and maximize learning. They allow teams to prototype new ways of working, which is grounded in network thinking, before scaling across the organization. The goal isn't to create one big idea. The ultimate goal is to build the capacity to innovate again and again across functions, levels, and regions. But here's the deeper truth. Ideas don't transform organizations. People connected in new ways do. We hope that you found this compact information on Network Innovation Labs interesting and thought-provoking. And we would love to hear any comments or answer any questions you have. Just reach out to Jeff on LinkedIn and you can schedule a call at your convenience. Ensemble Enabler is, and Network Leadership offers a lot of services to collaborate with companies in all kinds of ways, from executive mentoring for leaders, courses both online and live, network labs like the innovation lab you're talking about. We do other kinds of labs as well. Zero distance probes to get close to those customers and make sure we get the right kinds of products they are going to sell. Tools that are based on network science that we have developed, and enabling services to help organizations on the path to becoming a network organization. Thank you so much for using your valuable time for watching our executive briefing video. And we hope that you'll look at the other videos. We'll be constantly updating them, so there'll always be something new for pioneers who are wanting to become future-ready leaders. Thanks so much, and hope to see you again.